Welcome to interview program with my friend Mark Erickson. He's an intercessory man who has been known in many nations. The Lord has been using him in a mighty way. And in this program, we will dive in to his story and hear what remarkable things the Lord has done. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Mika.
But before we start, I just want to mention the first time we met. You came to Joensuu City Church 1997 to be a minister in the local church, and the Lord was moving in the church at that time. And when you came in, you had been in Cambodia as a missionary at the refugee camp. You came to the city, and for some reason, some people had painted the church back doors with blood. What happened?
I've been praying for all of Finland, and we were starting our trip with my wife to pray for every city and town through Finland. And when I was praying for the preparation to come to the east, the Russian border, Joensuu, I was asking God, show us how to pray. Show us, why are we going there? And then I had heard about the history of Karelia, that area, that there was more deaths from heart diseases than any other city or the area in the whole world per capita. And I thought, why? Why would that be? And so I was asking God, why? Why is there more people dying of heart problems in that area, in Joensuu area, than anywhere else in the world? And the Lord spoke to me that bitterness makes the heart sick. And then I started to get into the whole wars between Russia and Finland, even within the Orthodox and the Lutheran Church fighting, and all the bloodshed that happened on that border, and all of the broken hearts and people who got their homes taken away. And so I said, okay, well, what do we do about it? And I saw a vision of intercessors going down to the river, the mouth of the river, and praying and striking like Moses did. He struck the water, the bitter waters, and the bitter waters became sweet. So I called my friend Jukka, the pastor there, and I said, I think we need to do that. And so he said, okay, I'll get the intercessors together and we will go down to the river and do that prophetic act. And then I also saw that we took some of the water out of the river and brought it to the city church and started to wash one another's feet with the sweet water, asking forgiveness for all the sins that have been done in the past. And so we did that. When we came to Joensuu, we found out that the church had been broken in, and also, whoever were involved with the cursing the city and cursing the church, they put my name, big black letters, on the back of the church, cursing me and cursing the church. So I told the young people to go and clean up all that stuff, and I got excited because God, wherever God sends us, the enemy will try to stop us. But that gets me excited because I know that we are doing something good. That the enemy, if everything's going well, you better be careful think that you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And so we ended up doing that and blessing this nation and breaking the curses that have happened over the years on the border. And then washing one another's feet. And also there was about 100 intercessors crying and weeping over one another as we wash one another's feet with the sweet water.
Let's dive into the story of Mark Erickson, because many people might know what you have done maybe here in Finland or even in Sweden. But what was your origin? Tell us shortly, what was your upbringing and what happened?
Yeah, well, I was born in Hawaii. My father was in the Army, and then we moved to California, and I grew up in California. But my family wasn't a Christian family, so this is in the time of the Jesus revival kind of that was going on in California in the 70s. When I was born in 58, and then I grew up and went to high school in Los Angeles area, San Fernando Valley. And so there was a lot of drugs, a lot of hippies. That's where the hippie drug movement started. And so my two best friends that I grew up with, they got deeply into drugs. And I was playing American football, and I was also on the high school swim team. We got Los Angeles City champions 3 years in a row. So I couldn't take drugs. But I really wanted my friends' lives to be turned around. I saw their lives being destroyed by drugs. But I didn't know what to do. And so, then I was starting to think about life, and then I moved. When I had this dream when I got out of high school that I would go to Montana, because we had relatives who lived in Montana, and that's the big sky country they have the Yellowstone National Park, where the bears are roaming around, and you drive your car through the park, and you can look at the bears and be in your car safely. And so I had a dream when I got out of high school, I would move to Montana and become a forest ranger, like in Yogi Bear, the cartoon character, to take care of the trees and the bears in the forest and get away from all the problems of Los Angeles and all the drugs and all it was chaos. And so when I was 17, I moved to Montana, and I was going to join the Forest Service. But then I ended up getting a job with, that summer before the school started, I got a job in construction, and my boss, he was a Hell's Angel. He spent 5 years in San Quentin prison, one of the worst prisons in America, for beating people up. That's what the Hell's Angels did. They went around beating people up, and so I was working with him, and I never met somebody so evil. I tried to get away from all the lost angels of Los Angeles, and I ended up finding them in so-called my paradise in Montana, where the Glacier National Park and all the beautiful nature. And I ended up, working with this guy who just treated me so terribly. And then one weekend we went to another city, and we were working on an old Air Force base. And after work, we went to drink some alcohol. I was 17, he was 33, and the other worker was about his age. And after we drank alcohol, we went back to the hotel, and then they attacked me like they were going to use a woman. And because I played American football, I was good at breaking tackles, and I ran. I ran out of that hotel, and I was outside all by myself. And I thought, I just thinking about all the problems in the world, and all the drugs, and my family was not a close family. And I thought, if it's true, this Hell's Angel guy told me there is no purpose in life. And, that you live one time, so whatever makes you happy, you have to do it now. And beating people up, hurting people made him happy. I couldn't understand how hurting somebody can make somebody happy. And so I believed that there was a God up there someplace. And I decided that day that if there was no purpose in life, like this Hell's Angel said, I don't want to live anymore. And I decided that day that I was going to end my life. But I thought, before I do that, I will ask God to reveal himself to me. So I was looking in the clouds, and I said, God, if you're there, I want to know today. Because if you're not, I'm going to end my life.
How did you find your way back from that city that night?
Well, it's, the clouds opened up, and the sun was shining on me like a spotlight. I didn't hear any voices, and I didn't see anybody. But this peace that the Bible talks about that passes all understanding came over me for the first time in my life.
So what happened?
that transformed my life. I knew that God heard my cry. And I went down to the bookstore, and this is what I bought, this Bible. It's 50 years old now. And this is my bread, and the bread of life that came down from heaven that gave me new life, transformed me. And I've been reading it day and night ever since. It never gets old because God continually speaks to me every day through His Word.
So you got saved at the age of 17.
Yes.
And you bought this Bible. Please tell something of the story of this Bible. What did you start to do with it?
Yeah, I read in Psalms chapter 1 that he who meditates on my word day and night will be like a tree planted by the water that will never die and will bear fruit in season. So I thought, okay, meditate on it day and night. I was just doing what the Bible says. So this became my food. I was constantly in the Bible. And my brother, who also I was living with my brother at the time, he had thought I'd gone crazy. I used to smoke marijuana and drink beer with him, and all of a sudden I didn't do that anymore. And all I wanted to do is read my Bible and go to church. And he thought I'd gone crazy. But because of that, my life was transformed. The Word of God transforms us.
So how did your family react, and what was your relationship with your mom or with your dad?
Well, I tried to tell everybody. I wrote my mom and dad letters all the time telling them about God has transformed my life. He's so wonderful, and I'm new. I'm born again, and they had contacted my brother and said, Mark has gone crazy. Take drugs, drink alcohol, live with women, but don't become religious. That's the worst thing that can happen to you. So my whole family kind of turned on me. And but God gave me a new family in the church.
So nowadays, how is your relationship with your family?
Well, my brother, who he was against me totally. I'd been praying and praying for him, and he ended up, God radically saved him. He was coming down a road and was turning around, and this truck, he ran straight into a truck, but supernaturally came out the other side. And my brother said, Mark, you'll never know what happened to me. God saved my life. I tried to talk to him about Jesus, but he said, Mark, don't you ever talk to me about God. But now he was telling me that he was saved. And then we went with my brother to Missouri, where my parents lived. And we started to pray for my parents. And I would go into my closet downstairs and my where we were staying, and I started to pray, God, to save my mother and father, And my father came down to the closet and opened it up and said, what are you doing in the closet? And I said, well, the Bible says when you pray, go into the closet. And when you've shut the door in the secret place, pray to your Father in heaven who hears in secret, and He will answer you. And I said, get out of my closet, my father said. And then my mother, who was an alcoholic for 30 years, got saved. And she stopped drinking alcohol, and she got radically saved.
So when was this?
I got saved in 77. In 78.
Yeah.
Beginning of 78.
So your dream was to work in the nature, and
for a stranger.
Yeah, and be away from the city, and now you got saved.
Yeah.
So were you thinking of what will be the purpose of your life now? What happened? Did you start to seek the Lord and to find answers?
Yeah, I decided not to go to the forestry school. I wanted to get to know God. And so I went to the pastor, and I asked the pastor of this church, about 500 people. It was a Assembly of God church, and I said, can I get a job in the church? Because I thought God was in the church, and if I can only get a job in God's house, then I will be there all the time. I can talk to Him all the time, because I thought to talk to God, you have to go to the church, And he said, yeah, they need somebody to clean the church. So I got a job, and they gave me the keys to God's house. So I thought, okay, now I have the keys to God's house. I am going to find him. So in the daytime, I would clean the church. Upstairs was the 500 seats, and downstairs was a Christian school where they ran a school for the children. So in the daytime, I would clean, and then I would go home. And then in the night, when everybody was gone, I would sneak back into the church. And I knew that God is holy and you have to be holy. So I thought to be holy is like a man with white robe and walking really slow with a crutch, And I walked really slow to the altar because if you're really serious, you need to be at the altar. So I got on my knees at the altar, and I didn't know how to pray yet. So I said, God, here I am. Show me what to do with my life. I want your will to be done in my life. Mm-hmm. And I kept coming back night after night, but God never showed up. And then I was reading in my Bible about Esther and how she fasted and prayed for 3 days and nights for all the Jewish people to be saved. Mm. And I thought, okay, this must be how you really get to hear from God and get answers, is to fast. So I went 3 days without eating or drinking, just before God, asking him, God, show me what you want me to do with my life. And that's when I got this vision of these Asian people and the Lord that were starving to death, skin and bones. And I'd never seen anything like that before, but it was so clear vision. And the Lord said to me, Mark, will you go tell these people about me? Mm. And I said, yes, I will. And that's how I got my call to missions.
So later on, you moved to Cambodia, to a refugee camp. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, it happened because I first did my YWAM Youth in the Mission Discipleship Training School. And we did our first outreach from Montana to Mexico. And there was a lot of poor people in Mexico because I didn't know where these starving people were. I thought, well, maybe it's in Mexico. But there was a lot of poor people in Mexico, but I didn't see any starving people. And then it was after that my brother had gotten saved. And my brother went and did his discipleship training school in California, and I did my School of Evangelism in California. And I did my outreach to Argentina in 1978. That was the World Cup football games, the Mundial. And so I was thinking, well, maybe these starving people are in Argentina, but there was no starving people in Argentina. Mm. So I came back after that outreach. And then in 1979, it came on the news that the starving people are coming out of Cambodia into Thailand. And the American government was just calling anybody who wants to go and work to help these starving people, they can get a free one-way ticket from San Francisco to Thailand. And so I thought, wow, this is my opportunity. This is the people that God called me to. So then I went with a free one-way ticket. I only had enough money for 3 months to work in these refugee camps, but I was there for 10 years.
So in what kind of conditions you lived there, and what was your work and your ministry there?
Yeah, we worked in the war zone at the beginning, so that we can hear the bombs going off in the background. And in the refugee camp of 130,000, and we lived in the town close by, so we had to travel by car back and forth to the refugee camp. Mm. And there was a lot of chaos, and when you work in a war zone, that's often what it's like. And so at the beginning, all I had is my Bible. I didn't have a profession, so I was teaching the Bible to these refugees. Mm-hmm. And about 10,000 came to know Jesus in the first year working in the camps. And I didn't save any of them. We had like 100 workers in Youth of the Mission that were working in these refugee camps. I was just one of them, and there was other mission organizations too. But together, we would meet together to pray for these fast for these refugees, that they would come to know Jesus. And that's why I believe we saw such an incredible move of God and so many thousands coming to know Jesus.
Did you see any kind of miracles or healings in that refugee camp?
Well, to tell you the truth, at the beginning, see, I believe the Word of God. And the Bible says that if you have faith, you know, those who believe in me, you will cast out demons, you will perform miracles, you'll lay hands on the sick, and they will get healed. So I believe that. So I started to go through the hospitals and praying for all these dying people. And they all died. And I was so disappointed with God. God, what am I doing wrong? I've been fasting, I've been praying, I've been obeying your word. Why are they dying? And then somebody gave me the first prophecy, my leader actually. I was thinking about when Jesus turned the water into wine, when he started his first miracles. And I was thinking about that, and my leader turned to me and says, your day will come. And it went straight into my heart. You know, I knew that God was saying that one day I will pray for the sick and they will get healed. And so shortly after that, I started to pray for people and see miracles happen. But it was not very many. And I was wondering, why God, why? You know, now is the time. There's so many sick people here. Why aren't you healing them all? But I realized later that if I saw everybody got healed, I was so proud I would never be able to handle all the publicity, you know, and God needed to bring me through a time of discipleship and training so that I can humble myself, so that he can trust me with the miracles.
So you spent 10 years at the refugee camp, and the Lord was using you to disciple and to win people for the Lord. And then you met someone.
Yes, I decided that I would never get married because in the 70s there was a lot of teaching about Maranatha, Jesus is coming back, Maranatha music, you know, he's coming back soon. So I thought, well, soon to me means soon. I'm quite simple in my thinking. So I thought 5 years at the most and Jesus will be back. So I thought there's no time to mess around. So I just said, I'm not going to get married. I'm here to preach the gospel. I'm here to disciple these refugees. I was not thinking about, you know, getting married or women at all. And it was quite funny because we had 7 single guys and 90 single women working in youth of the mission in those camps. So I had a lot to choose from, and they were after me, but I was not interested. But then came Hanneli from Finland, and she was such a humble, she really loved the refugees, and she was a woman of prayer. And I thought, okay, God, what do I do about her? I'm attracted to her. And so, long story short, God spoke to me very clearly that she's going to be my wife. And God was speaking to her at the very same time. And so we ended up, in the first time we actually talked together, we knew that we were going to get married. And it wasn't long after that we came to Finland and got married.
Yeah, and we will speak about that in the next program. Mark, could you please speak to the viewers and just minister to them?
Yes, God is so wonderful and he's so awesome. He really loves us and each one of us, and he's got a perfect plan for each one of us. And as long as we seek him first, he will hear our heart and he will answer. And Lord, I pray for that for my friends. Lord, you know the plans that you have for them of future and hope in this time that the world is being shaken and falling apart. Lord, you want to give them a future and a destiny. Lord, I pray for that you would bless them, Father. In Jesus' name, amen.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear of the stories, what happened in Cambodia refugee camp and how the Lord was using you. Do you long that kind of things to happen when you live here in Scandinavia?
Yes, Yes, when I first came here, I didn't want to be here because we came, you know, my wife became sick, so we came, she had heart problems. Interesting, coming from Joensuu that has the most heart diseases in all the world. You know, we came with a Norwegian doctor and a Swedish nurse on Finnair, not knowing if she's going to live or die. And so when I got to Joensuu, I was just crying out to God, you know, to heal my wife so I can go back to the people. I spoke the Cambodian language. I love those people. I wanted to be with them when they went back to Cambodia, you know. And now I'm sitting here on the Holy Back Lake in Joensuu, Buhaselka, and, you know, crying out to God, God, say, you know, heal my wife so I can go back to the people that you called me to. You never called me to Finland. And so I was really upset with God, disappointed, and, you know, that he didn't heal my wife and that he brought me to this cold place. And I learned how to cross-country ski, so I skied out on the Holy Back Lake and cried out to God. And then I was starting to pray for Soviet Union. This is back in 1991 when I first came back to Finland. And it was still Soviet Union. It was still borders closed. And I saw how huge Soviet Union and Russia were, but you can't go there as a missionary. And how small Cambodian was. That's why I decided that, you know, I needed to pray for Russia, and then God called me to stay in Finland.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark, so much for this first program. We will continue this and share what the Lord started to do through you in Finland, in Sweden, and what the Lord has been doing. And thank you, everyone, for watching this. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Olet katsonut haastattelussa ohjelmaa Mark Ericksonista, joka lähti Yhdysvalloista, kohtasi Jumalan sielun mustassa yössä ja hänet lähetettiin Kambodzaan pakolaisleireille, jossa Jumala käytti häntä voimallisesti. Ja sitten hän muutti Suomeen, Ruotsiin ja palvelee esirukoilijana täällä. On tullut kylvön hetki. Kysy Herralta, kuinka voisit juuri nyt olla tukemassa TV7 työtä ja tätä ohjelmaa. Soita nyt numeroon 0600 020 30. Ruudulla myös muut antamistavat. Herra siunatkoon sinun lahjasi.